All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our second virtual event ever, getting to know New York City's plants. My name is Tessa O'Connell, and I'm from the NAC. I'm the Communications and Public Outreach Manager. So we are super excited to have you guys here tonight. I'm joined by Elizabeth and Helen to talk about native plants in New York City's natural areas and how you can get to know them better, especially in your next hike or visit to a park. So to get started, since this is virtual, we want to make it fun and interactive. Feel free to share who you are in the chat, introduce yourself. We'd love to know what your favorite park is to look at plants, just so we can kind of get a sense of where people have visited in the past, and maybe we can share a few new ideas for your next trip outside. And then I'm also going to be launching a poll right now, and we would like to just see where you're from. So what borough are you tuning in from? And then how would you rate yourself in plant ID? Just again, so we can get a sense of how in depth we should go with some of these tips and tricks. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of housekeeping, I'll be manning the tech as well as Elizabeth. So we'll be looking at the chat. Feel free throughout the event to send in any of your questions that you might have for Helen. We will also try to answer them as well if it's just a quick one-off. And then we will also save some questions to the end as well. So if we don't get it during the actual event, actual speaking program, we'll answer it at the end during the Q&A. And then finally, we are recording this event and we are live on Facebook. So if you have anybody at home that wants to tune in and didn't register ahead of time, they can just head to our Facebook page and watch this event there. So with that, I will wrap up my welcome and hand it over to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see all the responses coming in. A lot of people are suggesting some of my favorite places too. It's great to be with you all, even if it's virtually. I'm really excited to get to, learn a little bit more about your interests and your plant ID experience, and to introduce you to our expert, our resident expert here, Helen Forgione. To talk a little bit about New York City plants. So quick introductions of her and I. So I'm Elizabeth Yeager. I'm the Deputy Director of Programs for the Natural Areas Conservancy, and I help oversee all the different programs that we implement citywide to help advance our mission, our goals of restoring ecological health to the natural areas around the city, and to engage the community and the public in these natural areas and showcase what they're all about. And I am here with our resident plant guru, ecologist extraordinaire, Helen Forgione, our senior ecologist. And I'll be turning over the program to her for the majority of the rest of this. And I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more extensively. And I'm just going to give a very quick overview of the Natural Areas Conservancy before I turn it over to Helen. So we are the nonprofit partner to the New York City Parks Department that helps to restore and manage the natural areas across the city. So there's about 10,000 acres of natural areas on New York City parkland, and we just celebrated our 8th birthday a couple of weeks ago. We conducted an ecological assessment about 6 or 7 years ago, and Helen can, I'm sure, speak to a little bit more about that. But it assessed the health and the threat of New York City's natural areas, and we've been using that data to really help inform the management and the care of those forests and wetlands citywide. And one component of what we assessed was species composition and looking at native and invasive species. So you'll definitely be learning more about those native and invasive species today. And one of the many programs that we run that Helen is a pivotal figure for is the Conservancy Engagement Program, where we support other park conservancies citywide, like the Prospect Park Alliance, the Forest Park Trust, and several others, to help support their restoration work helping to assess the ecological health of their natural areas to keep them safe and well. And with that, I will turn it over to Helen and jump into the plant ID.
Let me unmute myself and say good evening. I'm so glad all of you are joining us tonight. My name is Helen Forgione. I'm the Senior Ecologist at the Natural Areas Conservancy. I've been a part of the group for the last going on 8 years. And as Elizabeth said, I started in the Natural Areas Conservancy and launched the ecological assessment for New York City and the 5 boroughs. Looking at the condition, the health and threats of our natural areas. In particular, wetlands, freshwater wetlands, tidal marshes, salt marshes, and uplands, including forests and grasslands. And that's where we're mainly going to be kind of journeying tonight, is focusing on our uplands and our forested areas. And I can see from our poll, let's see, so a lot of Brooklynites. Okay, go Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn too. And then we're all over the place. That's awesome. It's so nice to see all the boroughs represented, and some experience, novices, a lot. Okay, beautiful. Nice range. So we'll be talking about plants that you're likely to see, most common ones, plants that are in special places in the 5 boroughs. So kind of a cross section of different levels of novice to lots of experience, interest. So I'm going to close this and start with our tour. One of the first things that we did in the Natural Areas Conservancy was we looked at the city from a top-down view, and we wanted to understand what land cover filled out the 5 boroughs. And surprisingly, from the top view, about 40.5% of New York City is in some sort of green condition, either landscaped or natural. Landscaped being, you know, maybe your backyard or a street tree pit or a lawn in Prospect Park, versus the natural areas, those freshwater wetlands, salt marshes, and forests that we talked about, as well as grasslands. And you can see from this image where the green is distributed, there are natural areas in all 5 boroughs, all the way from the Bronx to Staten Island, the Rockaways, and Brooklyn and Queens. We've got great parks and natural spaces that you can get to, and we'll be highlighting some of those places and types of natural areas tonight. Beginning all the way up in the north, in the Bronx, where the rocky glaciated woods resemble New England, to the center kind of backbone that goes through Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens, which is the moraine, the place where the last glacier stopped and dropped off all of its sandy material, making up the Jamaica Bay and the South Shore of Staten Island, the Rockaways, all of the sandy, beachy, maritime places that we know in the city. So we'll be covering a lot of ground, and I'll start with giving you a preview of all the 5 boroughs that we'll be in. In the Bronx, we're going to focus a lot on Van Cortlandt Park, what we can see there. It's an easy park to get to, right off the 1 subway line, and accessible by bike to a lot of the community, even further north in Yonkers to Brooklyn. We're going to look at Prospect Park and some of the common plants that you'll be able to see there. If you can, I guess most of our audience can make their way there from somewhere in Brooklyn, and see the moraine forests that are remnant there, as well as some of the wildflower meadows that are newly growing in this park. In Manhattan, we'll look at Inwood Hill Park, also glaciated, dramatic cliffs and features in this park, with some tremendous old forests that are wonderful to walk through, accessible by the A-line. all the way at the other tip of Manhattan. In Queens, we're doing a double header covering not only Forest Park, a really intact oak, coastal oak, hickory, oak beech forest on the moraine as well, but we'll also look at a national park, Gateway National Recreation at Fort Tilden on the Rockaways, the sandy barrier island that seals Jamaica Bay waters in place. And on Staten Island, we'll try something a little different for some of you, maybe Wolf's Pond Park on the south shore of Staten Island, sandy, pebbly, sweet gum dominated forests. So lots of cool stuff to take a look at. So starting with something that everybody should know and maybe not love, but certainly be able to recognize is poison ivy. This is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on if you're an animal or a person, or rather a wild animal or a person, is one of our top 5 plants, which we found in our ecological assessment on the ground cover. Pretty much in every single park that we visited, every single forest, we see poison ivy in one form or another. So ID tips for this plant, and you probably have heard this little rhyme. Here's the leaf here with 3 different leaflets, 1, 2, 3. And here you can see an older leaf behind it, 3 leaflets. And the lingo goes, leaves of 3, let it be. If you touch this plant and you're susceptible, you'll get a horrific rash. And if you say to yourself, I'm immune, just bide your time. The more you're exposed to it, the more you react to it. Right now, I basically have to look at this plant and I break out. So this is something to keep your eye out for as you're hiking along or if you're walking in the forest. And it takes many different forms. On the right-hand side, you can see this climbing up a tree. And it almost looks like the tree itself. On the left side of this tree trunk is where the rootlet hairs have launched on to the tree and are holding fast to it and climbing up the entire tree into the canopy. And this doesn't damage the tree. Usually poison ivy will really only take off like crazy on a tree that might have a really open canopy and maybe on its way out, so that you won't see this really damaging healthy trees at all. But the hairy rootlets and kind of as large as an arm sometimes climbing up the side of the tree will be really distinctive. So keep your eye out for it, don't touch it. And the little rhyme continues, leaves of 3, let it be. Hairy rope, don't be a dope. So be careful and try not to touch that. But our wildlife loves that, loves poison ivy. It provides a lot of berries, fruit, especially during migration times for our songbirds to gobble up and give them energy. Another plant that is also one of the top 5 most common ground plants that we see in our forests is Virginia creeper, another native vine, also produces a lot of berries. And you can see it looks kind of on a quick glance similar to poison ivy, but it has its leaflets in 5s. The image on the right will show you that 5 leaflet grouping. The plant will trail along the ground. It'll also climb in much the same way as poison ivy onto trees or shrubs. And again, as a native plant, it doesn't kind of go too insane. So it doesn't crowd out other plants, but it will be often very dense. Beautiful fall color. We'll start to see that later in the summer with these blue fruit that birds really relish as well. So I'm sticking with the 5 top plants that you'll find in New York City uplands and forests. And unfortunately, my next one is mugwort, which is a non-native plant. It's from Europe, Asia. Its scientific name, Artemisia vulgaris. You might have seen Artemisia on different like herbal sorts of teas in stores. It has a lot of properties, medicinal properties, and some people grow it and actually harvest it in community gardens here in New York City. But it, as you can maybe tell from these images, it will grow very densely, cover a lot of ground. It has very thick rhizomes that form a mat and pretty much suppress any other vegetation from growing there. That's one of the reasons we're not too happy to see it in our natural areas, because it will take over an area and really take up all the space that we would hope to see plants that are more useful to our wildlife than Artemisia vulgaris. Rosa multiflora, the multiflora rose, is our number 4 plant, most common plant on the ground layer. It's beautiful, just finished flowering here in New York City. You may have smelled its wonderful fragrance. It's really, it was brought here from Japan as to control erosion and make hedgerows in between farm fields. And it certainly has fulfilled that goal. It has made dense hedgerows and dense understories in disturbed areas, old farm fields, and here in New York City, in disturbed forested areas or edges, it will take over, and you almost need a bulldozer to get through it. As a rose, you can expect thorns as well, and those little tiny rose hips, the little rose fruit, which birds will eat and pass around and distribute this plant. We have a lot of native rose species that our wildlife, insect life have co-evolved with, that provide a lot more value than the multiflora rose. However, it does provide benefit to birds for nest sites and as a fruit source, but we really don't want to see it dominate our forests and take over a lot of space. Multiflora rose, its common name and then part of its scientific name. It produces multiple flowers on a stem in an inflorescence. And as they first come out, they have multiple yellow stamens like most roses, and later fade to this kind of darker color. Right now, you'll still be able to find some flowering, but it's also in the phase where it's producing fruit. And our last of the number 5 is another non-native Japanese honeysuckle, Lonicera japonica. It was brought to the US as an ornamental, and it is very ornamental, and its fragrance is amazing. It's a smell of summer. If you've grown up here, you know that smell, and you can even pry the little flowers off and get some kind of honey, some nectar out of it. Insects will use this plant quite a lot as well, so it does provide some value, but it takes over our forest floors, it takes over our shrubs that are growing in forests, and will crowd out other plants. You can kind of sense a theme here. We've got a lot of common plants in New York City, and a lot of them are invasive and from other parts of the world where they have their own pests and controls on their health in their homelands. But here, they did not bring along their pests and viruses or insects, so they really can take off and grow prolifically. Some of these plants also have evergreen qualities that allow them to leaf out earlier than our natives. Later on, I'll be showing you one of our native honeysuckles, which is really gorgeous, and where you can see that. And it's not as prolific as the Japanese honeysuckle, because it's kept at bay by the native diseases and animals that will use it here in the US. So just to kind of sum up a little bit about invasive versus native plants. Here's another example. You might have seen porcelain berry ampelopsis. Looks a lot like grape. In fact, its scientific name refers to that it's grape-like. It's a vine, it's a woody vine. It will sprawl and grow around plants, twine around stems, and basically girdle trees, along with some other invasives that have that same quality. But here you can see in the image on the left how it really does most of its damage to young trees and shrubs by sprawling on top of them. And like the other invasive plants, common invasive plants that we've looked at, it will grow without check, without its controls from its native country or continents. So we get all excited when we do see native plants, because we know that those plants, along with our native insects and birds and mammals, have evolved together so that they recognize each other as food sources, or as a vehicle to distribute its seeds, or as a part of the community in which they live. So one of the things that we talk about when we look at these natural areas is we're looking not only at the individual species, but we're looking at the components that make up a community. For instance, in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, we have maples and oaks and hickories and ash trees. And when we look at these plants in different groups, they form different plant communities. One of the plant forest communities that we see in Prospect Park is an oak hickory forest, coastal oak hickory forest. And that community has certain components that we expect to see together. Doesn't always happen. There's a lot of impact in Prospect Park and our urban parks that reduce the health, but these places are under management, and we're doing a lot and working with partners to encourage the use of the native plants that are part of that community. And we'll talk more about that toward the end of this night. But on the right, you can see a meadow area that has been replanted and revegetated in Prospect Park. And some of the plants that you might see here, very typical of New York City. One that you'll see in almost every park is white snakeroot, Ageratina altissima. It's a very foamy looking flower. It's a composite, one in the sunflower family. So these little flower heads are made up of many tiny flowers. It has opposite branching leaves, triangular shaped leaves. You'll see this plant even in cracks in sidewalks some places where it has been able to hold on. It's a native forest understory wildflower that is flowering now. So take a look for that one. Another really abundant wildflower in New York City forests is whitewood aster, Eurybia divaricata. It used to be called Aster divaricata, Aster divaricatus. But with better taxonomy and better information about its genetic makeup, it's been put in a whole new genus, and we're happy that things are working a little more precisely, but it's starting to flower now. Later on in the fall, it will be abundantly flowering, and you can see that its center flowers will start off as yellow and then fade to this kind of reddish color. It has heart-shaped leaves that are distributed alternately on its stem. So take a look for that when you're out in the woods in Prospect Park. Purple flowering raspberry is another really cool plant that is native more to our northern areas, but it was planted in Prospect Park for a particular reason, because the ravine area was landscaped long ago by the founding of the park to resemble walk through the different areas in New York State. the Adirondack region or maybe the Catskill region would have this purple flowering raspberry growing in it. And you can see this planted and existing in Prospect Park, kind of the shadier, cooler spots. The fruit is edible. You could eat it. It's not particularly giant or juicy, but you won't perish if you try it. But do be careful and don't go for it unless you're with someone who really knows what you're about to eat.
And someone, Karen Miranda asked if the white snakeroot is flowering right now.
Yes, absolutely. Right now, you can see it just starting to flower. In some areas, some spots where it's maybe got a little more sunlight or it's drier, it might be launching off a little bit sooner. But that'll keep on going. We're all the way into later in the fall. So that's a great one to keep your eye on. Now this one, Enchanter's Nightshade, is flowering right now. It doesn't look like amazing. It's not going to bowl you over, but it's beautiful and delicate. Its name, Enchanter's Nightshade. Like somebody saw this kind of common, not knocking your socks off kind of wildflower and thought they would, really appreciate it and give it a gorgeous name too. You might recognize it if you walk through the woods and you get your socks full of these little sticky seeds. Those are already waiting for you if you walk off the path. So take a look for this lovely little wildflower as well. Something that will knock your socks off is pokeweed, Phytolacca americana, a native, vigorous wildflower, if you like. It's just starting to flower now with these white flowers on the slide on the right. It has these very distinctive, mottly, large leaves that you'll be able to identify it by even before it flowers. They really look like somebody painted them and didn't finish it up, or it's dripping a bit. Later on, the flowers will change into these very juicy magenta fruit that hang from thick, almost woody magenta stems. These will last quite late into the fall and be a sort of later migratory bird fruit to eat as they move along. Sometimes if you park your car near them, you'll be a bit disappointed because you'll get the stains from the birds and the fruit all over it, but it's a really nice thing to look at. It is poisonous, so if you have young kids with you and you're taking a hike, make sure that they don't decide to give it a nibble. So let's go all the way along the Moraine to Staten Island and then take a detour onto the South Shore for Wolf's Pond Park. Wolf's Pond Park is a wonderful example of sweet gum, oak, catbrier forest. It's beautiful, intact pieces of forest with wetlands and streams running through it. Lots of great hiking trails. I think there's even a biking trail that goes right through this area. And in fact, I just was there this May and saw scarlet tanagers all over the place and really peaceful and beautiful. One of the plants that you'll see in these kind of drier, oakier, catbrier woodlands is the wild sarsaparilla, Aurelia nudicalis. It also has compound leaves. You can see it holds them above it here, this kind of umbrella-like canopy of leaves, and it has this circular radial cluster of flowers below it. It's really a fantastic plant. Really shows you that this area has some great intact forest. Earlier in the spring.
We have a question about, you mentioned catbrier, and Katie is asking, what is catbrier?
So catbrier is a smilax species. So we have a lot of two really common smilax species in our forests, mostly in Queens and Staten Island. Smilax rotundifolia and Smilax, oh my goodness, glauca. So they are in the lily family. They have green stems, really stout thorns that will tear your clothes up if you decide to dash through there really fast. But they are a tremendous resource for our wildlife. They form these thickets that make it a lot of safe spots for them to nest. Deer will eat the young stems. It's almost like a tasty early spring treat for them, but then later on maybe it's a little bit more difficult for them to chaw through them. But they're really beautiful plants, and looking close, I don't have any images, I'm sorry. They have really beautiful structures as well. Kind of related to that is the wild lily of the valley on the right, Myanthemum canadense. It will form very lovely carpets, flowering a little bit later in May. It's pretty much finished, and we'll have berries on it now, starting to form these berries. 2 heart-shaped leaves on a flowering stalk, single heart-shaped leaves as it's just taking off as a younger plant. Really good thing to look out for in kind of the mossier, drier, rich forests definitely in Wolf's Pond Park, also in Queens and the Bronx. Also on the left of this slide is Spring Beauties. They were a much earlier spring wildflower, but they're really wonderful to see. They're in the same family as portulaca, really juicy kind of green leaves, beautiful ant dispersed seeds and these flowers. And here's the promised native honeysuckle, the trumpet honeysuckle, which you can see in Wolf's Pond Park. Some of the richer sweet gum forests there, Lonicera sempervirens. It's got a vibrant, wonderful color, not as prolific as the Japanese honeysuckle. It kind of keeps under control a little bit better. A lot of people are planting this as a wildflower in their gardens. That's kind of a great way to keep this plant in our world. Hummingbirds will come to it and pollinate it while they grab some nectar from this plant. Now for something completely different. Going to Fort Tilden in Queens, the barrier beach that makes up part of the Rockaways. This is a much more sandy, open, dry kind of community. You'll see completely different suite of plants. Our maritime scrubby forests, our dunes and shrubby dunes here. One of our partners at Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy is showing off the northern bayberry, Morella pennsylvanica, a very fragrant leaved and fruit. These kind of gray, waxy fruit will be starting to form on this plant now. That's really a great indicator of this kind of coastal community, maritime community, relished by wildlife as well. And something that is has expanded its range. It's this yucca, or Adam's leaf yucca. It's more typical of South Barrier kind of beach areas in North Carolina. It's spread into and naturalized as far up as north as New England and the coastal areas, and it's present in Fort Tilden as well as a few other parks. Marine Park in Brooklyn, you can see some of this as well. These very long spear-like leaves. Another name for it is Adam's needle. If you look at the tip of the leaf, it has as stiff and sharp as a needle, and you could almost strip that from the leaf itself and use it to sew up kind of a rustic, crafty project, if you like. But right now it's flowering. You can spot these gorgeous, tall inflorescences of white flowers pollinated by moths. Really, really cool to see. Something else typical of our shorelines and maritime forests are the sumacs. These images here are Rus glabra, the smooth sumac. We also have staghorn sumac, which has a fuzzier stem and inflorescence. The shining sumac, which has wings along the stem and is more typical of really beachy spots. Right now, it's in fruit and flower. On the right, you can see the red fruit on the inflorescence that form, and it's a really distinctive plant to spot even from a distance with these columnar fruit inflorescences, infructescences, if you want. Milkweeds are also abundant in our beachy areas, our maritime areas, and in other roadside areas and gardens as well. I have here two images, one of the common milkweed and its pod on the left, and on the right, butterfly weed, a different milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa. They differ by their flower inflorescence structure. The common milkweed is almost circular. The butterfly weed is flat-topped, but you don't even have to go that far. When you see those colors really popping out at you with the butterfly weed, and everyone, I guess, knows that the common milkweed in particular is of tremendous value to our monarch butterflies, which their caterpillars feed on the leaves of all the milkweeds, but in particular the common milkweed really provides the toxins that the monarch butterflies need to ingest to make them distasteful to their predators. And our goldenrods and mulleins are also very typical of sandier, drier seaside areas. The seaside goldenrod on the left and the common mullein that forms that long, towering flower stalk and very fuzzy, soft leaves. The mullein is from Europe and was brought here when Europeans came to this country. But the seaside goldenrod is a native, along with all the other goldenrods that we see in our region here. Seaside goldenrod will have very thick, fleshy, juicy leaves that help protect it from desiccation and also keep it holding moisture, holding water on these drier sorts of environments.
Helen, we received a question from Ira. He was asking if there's any wild butterfly weed in the city.
Not all butterfly weed that you see in the city is planted. I couldn't tell you how to distinguish between what has been planted in the past and what was originally here. They will look virtually the same or the same. So I can only guess at which is original from original seed sources, but it certainly is used a lot in the landscape. So the majority that you do see will be planted. It's also so attractive, as you can imagine. A lot was picked even in the early days of this of New York being a city, so that our numbers of maybe original populations are probably really low. Get back to me, shoot me an email, and I'll see if I can talk to someone at our Greenbelt Native Plant Center and get a better bead on that answer to that question. That's a really good point. And replanting our native wildflowers and woody plants is a really important way to keep them in our world. Our Greenbelt Native Plant Center collects seeds from local populations in a scientific way to make sure that we're also keeping that same genetic populations here in New York City. So that's a really good point, Ira. So I'm going to just move to Forest Park, Queens, which is still in the same borough, but a completely different environment. It's a wooded area, a forested area on the moraine, on the backbone, the rocky backbone of Queens, and it contains a whole different set of plant life. The forests there are dominated by oaks, white oak, red oak, black oak, some scarlet, some pin oak, and has a really wonderful, intact understory of the typical shrubs of this plant community: maple leaf viburnum, arrowwood viburnum, amelanchier, some of the juneberries. But we're starring maple leaf viburnum, which is flowering right now. As its name suggests, its leaves are maple shaped, that palmately veined shape. They're opposite each other, similar to a maple, but they're fuzzy and very different in texture than the maple trees. Right now, they have these flat top clusters of pale white or sometimes pinkish tinged flowers. Really beautiful plants. Another component that you might see in the dry oak hickory forests in Forest Park, Queens, is the roundleaf pyrola. And anyone who knows me knows I go bonkers when I see this plant. I've worked in New York City for the last 30 years, and our forests used to burn on a regular basis. And there were economic downturns, and we weren't able to maintain our areas as well as we liked, and people trampled and compacted the soil, and you basically never saw this roundleaf pyrola. And as health conditions have increased, now you can find it in so many forested parks, and it kind of thrills me every time. It's got these round evergreen leaves. It forms new leaves every year, and they're beautiful and glossy, and these lovely stems with white kind of bell-shaped flowers. Another wildflower, native wildflower that you're likely to see in Forest Park is one of the JOE-PYE weeds, sweet JOE-PYE weed, Eutrochium purpureum. This is a plant that is typical of dry forests, not one of the wetland JOE-PYE weeds. We have many of these of this genus that used to be Eupatorium. Now it goes by Eutrochium. Whorled leaves or opposite leaves, or perfoliate leaves where the stem will grow right through a leaf. In the case of the sweet JOE-PYE weed, leaves in whorls of 4 typically, and it's just starting to flower now. So now is a great time to get out into our woods and see what you can find of this plant. Blasting off to the Bronx, our glaciated rocky terrain with oak tulip forests, even sugar maple forests, oak forests. It's really a park that's wonderful to see a lot of our spring ephemerals. These wildflowers come up early in the spring. This group of wildflowers, this kind of category, come up early in the spring before trees leaf out, develop their leaves, their flowers, their fruit, are pollinated, and then you don't see any other evidence of them until the following spring. Dutchman's breeches on the left and trout lily on the right are really great examples of spring ephemerals. They're basically disappeared from the scene right now, but I just wanted to make sure we touched on some of these plants that are really wonderful woodland components of our richer, moister, less disturbed, and if you like, healthier forests. Bloodroot is another great example of that. Very snowy white flowers. If you were to bruise a stem or a leaf, you would see the reddish sap come out of it, that which it gets its name. And something that a plant that people maybe don't think of as much as an early spring wildflower, but one of our sedges, native sedges, Pennsylvania sedge, is really a beautiful flower that you can spot early in the spring. Its leaves are still in evidence now. Very grass-like leaves, but it has beautiful, delicate sedge flowers. This kind of reddish top with a fuzzy stamens popping out of it. Really something great to keep an eye out when everything is bare in our forests. Right now in Van Cortlandt Park, you can also spot the Indian pipe, Monotropa uniflora, coming up. This is a really unique plant. It does not have chlorophyll. It does not have any green photosynthesizing leaves, but it has these really ghostly white stems and flowers that will be emerging now and starting to open up. It'll be in evidence all summer, and then later on towards the end of the year, it will turn black as it forms seed and just stand all winter long where you can spot it. Wingstem on the right, verbicina, is also a really unique composite flower that you will see in Van Cortlandt Park. A little bit later in the summer, early fall, at these tall yellow flowers with these unique seed pods and very distinct wings on its stems. Otherwise, it looks very much like a sunflower. And our last park on this whirlwind tour is Inwood Hill Park in Manhattan, with really unique, interesting geology. With this on the right, you can see this kettle hole formation from when this park was glaciated and water was rushing through the rocky stones left behind by the glacier and creating these kind of corkscrewed areas where it hollowed out a part of the rock. Really interesting formations and caves and tall cliffs. Wonderful place to explore. It's also really well noted for its amazing tulip tree forests. In the center of the park is an area called the Clove, where there are towering tulip trees. Here you can see on the right this really ridged bark and almost very angular branches and large branches that form, making it easy to see that structure early in the spring and even now, and identify it as tulip trees, Liriodendron tulipifera. The flowers just finished, and you may be able to still see a few on the ground. They're held way up high in the canopy, so unless a squirrel knobs one down at you, you're not likely to see them. But they're really beautiful magnolia family flowers, very primitive looking, very large stamens, and the petals and sepals here in these kind of pale yellow green with orange stripes on the petals. Another plant that you're able to see in abundance in Inwood Hill Park is the spicebush, Lindera benzoin. It's a native understory shrub. A spicebush you might gather from that common name. The leaves, if you bruise them, have a really terrific spicy odor. On the left, you can see it as it's early flowering in March, as early as March. It'll form this foamy-like yellow layer in Inwood Hill Park where you can observe those flowers close up. Now they're beautiful green leaves are in abundance and create really lovely shade in that understory layer. In the in the wetter parts of Inwood Hill Park, you'll spot the jewelweed, or another common name for it is touch-me-not. These orange flowers develop into seed pods that, as you touch them, when they're ripe, will burst and shoot their seeds quite a distance, and that's how this plant disperses itself throughout the ground layer. It's really a pretty cool plant, one of those fun things to show kids and get them excited about plant dispersal. Something that is in evidence that maybe I'm less excited about is the lesser celandine, a non-native invasive plant. It's also ephemeral, a spring ephemeral. You can see this in many, many different parks. Inwood Hill is one of the parks, but it's unfortunately become very abundant. It forms these carpets and of glossy leaves and, you know, beautiful yellow flowers, but it disperses by these little tiny bulblets that move around through water, rainwater. Animals will move them around, and although it dies down later in spring and you can't see it, it takes up the space quite well and prevents a lot of our native wildflowers, some of those other ephemerals that you see, from persisting and existing. Unfortunately, that impact is pretty huge, in that the bees and early insects that are looking for those spring ephemerals that they've evolved with will not find them if this plant does crowd them out. It's very difficult to control. So just wanted to point that one out for you too, so that you can keep a bead on that in the early spring. Oops. And, ooh, how did I do that? I'm just going to get right back here. And pop up some of these resources that you might want to check out. Our New York City nature map is a great way to find how you can get to these different parks that we've mentioned. It's available on the NAC website, and will give you even more details about some of the plants and conditions of the natural areas that we've assessed in all 5 boroughs. So it's a really great tool if you're going out to explore and identify plants, of what you might see where, and even where you could go to really spot some plants you're interested in finding. And I also popped out a link to our one of our tools that the Natural Areas Conservancy developed, that is built around this idea of plant communities. It's an application that allows you to identify what plant community you're in by what plants you're observing, and to choose from a planting list climate adapted plants that are typical of that plant community, and are most beneficial and to our wildlife, and are most likely to be to survive well given our changing climate conditions. So I'll just wrap that up and say, you know, please do contact me if you have some specific questions. I'm always happy to get you the information you might want, or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm really excited to go out onto a hike and look for some of these. We do have a couple questions. One of them, most recently in this last section, Nina was asking about the monotropia, the little kind of the ghostly white feature. She was asking, are those the leaves or the flowers or both that we were looking at?
Yeah, so the whole stem is white, the flower is white. The leaves are kind of reduced to sort of bracts along the stem. They don't serve the function of a typical leaf that would photosynthesize. This plant gets a lot of its or gets all of its nutrients through relationships with different mycorrhizal fungi, um, and um, and it doesn't provide any nutrients by itself. It's not able to produce its own sugars. It is a flowering plant. It does produce flowers. That kind of bell-shaped flower is a flower that will produce seed and fruit. So yeah, just one of those cool things in our plant world.
That's great. And then also we had a question earlier from Jessica. She was asking if you could give a little bit more guidance on how to identify nightshade.
Yeah, so the Enchanter's nightshade. Yeah, so it is, it's got opposite leaves. They are not incredibly distinctively shaped, but they do have sharp edges, kind of irregular edges. The stem is not a square stem. It's not in the mint family. It is, and the flowers are very small. I think they're 5-parted flowers. But if you look up close, you can see distinctly their petals, and those really sticky, not almost Velcro-like little seeds will be a real telltale kind of feature.
That's great. We don't have any other questions right now. Well, just last question. Ira just asked, is Enchanter's nightshade not really nightshade?
Oh my gosh. I am, it's in the same family as evening primrose, I think. I can't believe I'm like having a little gap in my brain. It's not a nightshade. It's not a solanaceous or solanaceae plant. That's true.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. If you have any last minute, it seems like the chat has been going the whole time. This is great to see everybody's feedback and hear about your experiences in the parks and with plants. So thank you so much to Helen and for Elizabeth for emceeing and handling the chat and Q&A. We're so glad you guys could spend an hour with us this evening. Like we mentioned in the chat, there definitely will be a recording after this event. You can also easily access this on our Facebook page under the video section. The Facebook Live will be automatically saved there. So you could watch this again. You can share it with your friends and family, anything you'd like. And always feel free to reach out to us and follow us on social media to stay up to date. We want to just give a quick thank you to Con Edison for making this program possible. They sponsor our summer public programming, usually out in the parks, but this summer we've had to go virtual. So we want to thank them for their support. And thank you guys for tuning in. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thanks for us.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.